Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties getting the live stream set up. Hopefully, it directs all of your members once this Zoom room gets full. But I'm going to give it just a few more minutes before we get started. But yeah, I'm really excited. Hi, everyone. For those of you just joining, we're going to get started in just a second. I'm just going to give it like 2 more minutes because I know the link opened a little late. So no worries. Just so everyone knows, all of you guys are muted. I'm the only one that you all can hear. So no, don't stress about that or anything. So I think it's almost 7:05. So I think that I will go ahead and get started. Let me turn my video on. Okay. Hi, everyone. So before we get started with today's webinar, I have a few announcements that I want to share with the community on behalf of Panhellenic and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The first is that there is an anti-racist book club that Fraternity and Sorority Programming, FSP, is putting on. This is a great opportunity for all of you guys to learn more and become more educated about really important topics. It's something that affects our own community and Greek life in general. And so we, being completely transparent with a lot of you here today, we do not have a lot of Panhellenic representation in the book club, and we would really like more members of the Panhellenic community to sign up. I will be putting the sign up information on the Panhellenic Instagram after this webinar. Please try to sign up this week. It won't take up a lot of your time, and the book is not a challenging read, but a really insightful read. And so, like I said, we really encourage you to apply. And if anyone has any questions or concerns, they can throw them into the DEI feedback form that hopefully all of your Panhellenic delegates are sharing with you, or this at the end of last presentation, and as always in the Panhellenic Instagram link tree. Or you can write it in the attendance check-in that will be at the end of this DEI webinar. The other quick announcement that I wanted to make is that Panhellenic Executive Board applications opened up yesterday. They close October 26th at 11:59 p.m. So if anyone in the community is thinking about running for the Panhellenic Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion position, you are more than welcome to send me an email and we can chat about it if you have any questions. There's a mandatory information session for those who are interested in applying on October 17th. And you can learn more there. If you figure out that you want to apply, say after that meeting, or you have a time conflict and you can't attend that meeting, no worries. You can just go ahead and email Molly Krantz, the Panhellenic president, and we'll figure something out. So no stress there. But I really encourage you to apply. This has been a great position. Hopefully you all feel in the community that this is starting to make a difference. We don't move mountains, every day, but we move mountains slowly, one day at a time. And so I think that's something to keep in mind if you are considering applying for this position. Okay, well, with that said, we will begin our second Panhellenic DEI presentation on cultural appropriation and education. Just so you all know, this topic was picked because this is October, and October has Halloween in it. And Halloween is an example where we see a lot of people probably unintentionally committing cultural appropriation. We want to make sure our community is educated so we don't see that this year. So to get things started, what is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is adopting certain elements from one culture you do not belong to without the consent of the people who do belong to that culture. Still, it can be difficult for people to understand, and some struggle with the idea of what's cultural appropriation versus what's cultural appreciation. We'll break that down in a bit. And today we're going to cover what that term actually means. So how does cultural appropriation get started? Well, first and foremost, many different people making up of all of the different ethnicities that call the United States home kind of come together. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard the United States referred to as a melting pot. So it makes sense that we do have influences on one another. Now, I mentioned the word ethnicity, so I want to take a quick pause. And I want everyone to think about what the difference between race and ethnicity is, because this is something that these terms should not be used interchangeably, but we see a lot that they are. And so we want to make sure that you guys all know what those words mean. So race is typically associated with physical features and hair texture, and ethnicity relates to your cultural expression. Now, it's important to remember that this doesn't mean that there can't be overlap. So we aren't strict boxes with specific labels, but we do have differences, and you might check a different ethnicity than you do race, and that's okay. That's perfectly acceptable. Okay, so quick activity for you all just to kind of get us in the zone and ready for this presentation. I just want you guys to self-reflect. So take 2 minutes and maybe write down on a piece of paper next to you, or even just think about it. Do you yourself have a box to check when you fill out forms? Maybe these are like forms when you go to the DMV to do something with your license, or when you were applying for college. And then how does this representation or lack thereof, if you don't have a box to check when you fill out forms, make you feel? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes. I'm going to turn my camera off, and I'm going to turn my mic off, and then we'll come back. Okay, hopefully you guys had a minute to kind of think that one over. I will speak very transparently about myself. I think many of you know, I identify as a member of the disabled community, and while that is not a race or an ethnicity, being disabled certainly comes along with its own culture. And so I don't always have a box to check, and that lack of representation feels frustrating. It feels as though I'm ignored and that I'm not always wanted to even be offered a seat at the table. And so this happens to many, many people of many different races, ethnicities, the cultures that they belong to. And so we as a community want to make sure that we're always leaving room for those boxes to be checked, but we're not putting people in boxes themselves. Okay. Moving on. So let's talk a little bit about diverse communities and what those mean. So Americans who grew up in diverse communities may pick up the dialect, the customs, the religious traditions of the cultural groups that surround them. This is different from cultural appropriation. This is not cultural appropriation. It makes sense. We go to school with people and we start saying the same phrases that some of our friends say. We maybe move somewhere and all of a sudden we have an accent. Those things aren't cultural appropriation. Those are natural. Cultural appropriation is an entirely different matter. It has little to do with one's exposure to and familiarity with different cultures, but instead, cultural appropriation typically involves members of a dominant group exploiting the culture of less privileged groups. Quite often, this is done along racial and ethnic lines with little understanding of the latter's history, experience, and traditions. Okay. So I really want to make sure that we are emphasizing the fact that this presentation was titled Cultural Appropriation and Education because we are here to learn. So one more time, regardless of whether or not I sound like a broken record, we're going to go over a final textbook style definition by breaking it down. So first, let's talk about culture. Culture is the beliefs, ideas, traditions, speech, and material objects associated with a particular group of people. So like I said, as someone who identifies as disabled, there's a disability culture. We're all in Panhellenic. There's kind of a culture of Panhellenic, our community. Appropriation is the illegal, unfair, or unjust taking of something that doesn't belong to you. So now let's put it together and get our next level definition. The taking of intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expression, or artifacts from someone else's culture without permission. This can include unauthorized use of another culture's dance, dress, music, language, folklore, cuisine, traditional medicine, religious symbols, or other things. It's most likely to be harmful when the source community is a minority group that has been oppressed or exploited in other ways, or when the object of appropriation is particularly sensitive. So example, sacred objects. And we're going to talk a little bit about those when we talk about the appropriation of Native cultures in a second. So let's give this some context within the United States, within our own country. Cultural appropriation almost always involves members of the dominant culture, which we kind of talked about a little, how cultural appropriation takes on a different meaning when we recognize that it's often minority cultures that are the ones that are affected by it. So it almost always involves members of the dominant culture or those who identify with the dominant culture, borrowing, in quotes, from the cultures of minority groups. So in the United States, Black people, Asians, Latinxes, and Native Americans are often targeted for cultural appropriation. These can kind of talk about music and dance, martial arts and dress, Chicano style and fashion, fashions, decorations, and cultural symbols. Those are particular areas that some of these minority cultures are culturally appropriated. And we're going to dive into each of them now. But first, let's talk about borrowing and how it is a key concept of cultural appropriation. So I'm sure we've all been there, and you know how, and there's this kind of an example that I'm going to give, and I'm going to ask you all to imagine this scenario. You're in class in high school, and your teacher tells you to take out a piece of paper for an exit activity. What's the first thing that happens? Someone turns to you and says, "Hey, can I borrow a piece of paper?" And your response is probably, oh, sure, of course, here you go. and you know that, or at least you're not expecting that, you will get that piece of paper in return because it has their marks all over it. You don't need it anymore. So when you can't return something or you don't own something, the best practice is to just leave it alone. So with a piece of paper, you're not borrowing it. You're saying, hey, can I have a piece of paper? But you can't borrow culture like you can borrow, for example, a pencil. But you can either live the culture or appreciate the culture. And something that is important to note is when you are saying that you are borrowing an element of a particular culture, you're showing insensitivity to historical and current sufferings of marginalized groups. Okay, so our first example of cultural appropriation is appropriation in music. This is especially relevant in today's world of TikTok, and also as some of you all are leaders in your individual chapters. So for example, we're seeing lots of philanthropy events starting to be in person again, which is so exciting, but you'll probably play music in the background of all of these events. And it's important, or for even further examples, date dashes, as those start to happen, music's going to be played. And we want to make sure that you're playing appropriate music and that you're appreciating the music that you're playing and not appropriating the culture from which the music comes from. So let's take it back quite a few decades and go back to the 1950s, where white musicians appropriated the music that their Black counterparts invented. So blatant racism and discrimination made Black people have to sit on the sidelines of society in America. Record executives then put white artists on deals and had them replicate the sounds of Black musicians. So here's what happened. We saw this music was gaining traction. It was becoming popular. People saw Black artists putting this out there. And then what happened is these record executives and the people in charge of the different labels found different white musicians and said, okay, now you're going to emulate this style and we'll give you all the credit for it and none of the credit to the Black pioneers that started it. I don't know if anyone follows kind of like Taylor Swift and her whole drama with the way that her music was kind of taken out from under her, but she's an example of a white woman who had her music taken from her, and she now has gotten all this sympathy and empathy from musicians everywhere and from citizens and her listeners and all of the people. What about all of the Black pioneers that came before her 70, 60, 50 years ago, and all of their work that was appropriated and taken out from under them? And they were never given the opportunity to re-record their music because they didn't have the same privileges that she had to go open her own studio and start them again. So I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about a few of them here because I think it's important that we learn about them and still pay homage to them, because their music and the way that they started, it still influences the music that we listen to today. So rock and roll is commonly associated with white people, and its Black pioneers, like I mentioned before, do not get the credit that they deserve. So I've listed many people here, Little Richard, Ike Turner, Bo Diddley, and Chuck Berry, and I encourage all of you guys to look them up on your own and learn about them. But I want to talk about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. So I'm sure all of you know who Elvis Presley is, and this is one of Elvis Presley's managers and one of his record label executives actually is quoted saying this after Elvis Presley had so much success in his career. And he says, "When you see Elvis Presley singing songs early in his career, I think you should imagine he is channeling Rosetta Tharpe. It's not an image that I think we're used to thinking of in rock and roll history. We don't think about the Black woman behind it." So this is something that I really want us to remember and keep in mind as we listen to a rock and roll song tomorrow. Where did it start? It started with women women of color, like Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Okay, so we've talked about cultural appropriation in the 1950s. So let's bring it into today. Cultural appropriation in the 21st century. It still remains a concern. Two really popular and recent examples include Gwen Stefani, who's been subject to criticism for her fixation on Harajuku culture from Japan. Gwen Stefani herself is not Japanese, and she has not, people do not perceive that she has been appreciating the culture, but rather using it for different outfits that she wears on tours that she sells out, where then she pockets all of the money and does not give any back to the culture that she's appropriating from. Miley Cyrus also has a long history of cultural appropriation, dancing in historically African-American dance moves, and then taking credit for them as her own that she came up with. And then also she'll put people of color, she'll hire them as backup dancers. And when we talk about representation and the redistribution of wealth and hiring minorities so that we can improve diversity and equity and inclusion in all fields, especially the entertainment industry, it's one step to hire somebody. However, one of the things that Miley Cyrus has become subject to criticism for is that a lot of these people of color backup dancers were put into those like giant bear costumes and they weren't seen. So they were hidden behind bear costumes. And so while she may think that she is doing a good job and that she's giving people representation, she's really not taking it a step further and celebrating that culture. She's hiding it behind bear costumes. And the purpose of this is not to hate on Miley Cyrus, but the purpose of this is to make everyone aware that this is what goes on behind the scenes. And as long as we're aware of it and then actively calling each other in to do better, we'll have a better community. We'll have a better entertainment industry that is more in tune with diversity, with equity, with inclusion. Okay, so now we're going to move on to appropriation of Native cultures. I thought this was very important for many reasons, but one thing that I do also want to mention before we get into this a little bit is that next month, and I won't see you guys again in this setting until our next webinar, which is November 18th. November is Native American Heritage Month. So keep that in mind as you're celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day is coming up. And so that's why it's really important that we recognize that Native cultures have long been appropriated. This is especially appropriate because we all attend the University of Arizona, and the U of A is a land grant university. So we abide by the Land Acknowledgement Agreement. So I don't know if you all want to just put in the chat really quickly a yes if you have heard the land acknowledgement been said before, maybe at a club meeting, maybe at your chapter meetings, maybe in some sort of event that you attended. I just want to know if you've heard it and then a no if you haven't. And this is not a judgment thing. Like I'm not going to keep track of who has heard it and who hasn't. I just kind of want to know where we're at with it. Okay, I'm seeing some no's, yeses. It looks like it's kind of maybe 50-50. Definitely not everyone, but definitely not no one. So that's progress. We're not exactly where we want to be yet, but that's definitely progress. Okay, awesome. You guys are good. So I'm going today to read you all the land acknowledgement while we're all kind of attending this from a virtual platform, and some of us may not be on university land. I still think it's important that we acknowledge it. So I'm going to read it, and then all of you can say yes after, because you'll have heard it from me. So the University of Arizona Land Acknowledgement reads, "We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous people. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service." So that is the land acknowledgement. I encourage those of you who have chapter on an on-campus facility, if you have chapter at your chapter facility that also is on U of A land, read this land acknowledgement before each of your chapters. It's really important. We have members of our own community that are members of Native nations, Native cultures, and we want people to feel represented and acknowledged. So going off of that, please keep in mind that it's important that we do not appropriate their culture, as we just started acknowledging their land. ASUA, for those of you who don't know, the Associates of the University of Arizona, actually passed a legislation last year about reading this agreement at different club meetings. And we're very lucky because our executive vice president of ASUA is actually a member of the great community. So if you have any questions for her about the band acknowledgement, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer anybody over at ASUA as well about that. So going forward, Native American fashion, art, and rituals have also been appropriated into mainstream US culture. So I want to bring up a really popular and relevant example here, and that is dream catchers. So everybody loves to decorate their dorm rooms and their apartments in what is commonly referred to as like a boho chic theme, with lots of macrame and then what people love to refer to as dream catchers. Now, I purposely did not include any images of dream catchers. I didn't include a definition of a dream catcher because we are hoping to work with NASA, which is the Native American Student Association here on campus, to do an event about cultural appropriation of Native cultures and dream catchers and other things during Native American Heritage Month. And I want to respect them. And I also want to encourage you all to reach out to them and actually kind of take some of this education into your own hands. So I'm putting that taste out there. But I do have a little bit of information on whether or not having a dream catcher is cultural appropriation. And I took sources and quotes from members of the Native community who write blog posts about this topic. And essentially, it all depends on context. So it depends on where you get your dream catcher. Did you attend an event, learn something about a specific tribal nation, and or meet a Native person and choose to support their art by purchasing one from them? Then yes, that's totally okay. You can have that dream catcher. But did you see it at your favorite shopping center and know nothing about where it came from or what it means? Then no, probably not a good idea to have one. Basically, you don't want to be someone who has a dream catcher that was bought from Urban Outfitters. Another example of Native American cultural appropriation, people are going to Sedona and participating in indigenous rituals and ceremonies that are not performed by Native Americans, but by lodge retreat owners trying to make money. And this is not okay. This actually happened in Sedona in 2009, and 3 people died, and Natives faced a lot of backlash that was undeserved because it wasn't planned or put on by those who knew how to do it. And then they faced a lot of the backlash for the horrible outcome that took place. The host of this event was actually sued for impersonation and was punished. So cultural appropriation is a serious thing and it can become a crime. You can be in serious legal trouble for it. Some more examples. Cultural appropriation takes many, many forms. So Buddhist tattoos, Muslim-inspired headdresses as fashion, white gay men adopting the dialect of Black women. These are all other examples of cultural appropriation. And of course, the examples can be endless and context is often key. As we begin to wrap up here, I want us to take a minute and think about what we can do as members of the community to prevent cultural appropriation. So here's what we can do. We can ask ourselves, was the tattoo done in reverence or because it's cool? Would a Muslim man wearing the keffiyeh be considered a terrorist for that simple fact? At the same time, if a white man wears it, is it a fashion statement? Are you being intersectional when you as a minority member take from another minority group? These are really important questions to ask ourselves. And you may think, oh, I don't commit a cultural appropriation, or I didn't mean to. And this goes back to our first DEI webinar last semester, and that's all about intent versus impact. You might not have this intention to be mean or to disrespect somebody's culture, but if you're not realizing that the intent of the impact of your actions can be very damaging to someone or to a group of people, then that's the problem. So I also want us to remember this in the context of Halloween costumes. You guys might think it's a good idea to dress up as something because you think it's funny. But do you think it's funny because it's a cultural element? Would the person that belongs to that culture think it's funny? If the answer is no, it's probably not a good idea. And my biggest advice to you is if you're questioning whether or not you should wear it, you shouldn't. So with that being said, thank you all so much for attending this DEI webinar. I would love to hear questions, comments, concerns, feedback. This is the attendance check-in, the QR code. And the link will also be given out to Panhellenic delegates or your individual chapter diversity, equity, and inclusion chairs. So be mindful of that. The other thing that I want to keep you guys kind of thinking about is that last webinar, I said that at the end, those of you who have attended all 4 will possibly receive like a little prize. I'll pick like 10 or 5 random participants. What we're actually going to do is now change it up a little bit. So instead of a prize that's like a Starbucks gift card to a company that already has a ton of money, we're going to give you a gift card to a minority-owned business in Tucson. And then we're also going to donate money on your behalf to a charity that benefits a diversity, equity, and inclusion cause. For instance, the Tucson Therapy Fund provides therapy money for Black women and children and other BIPOC individuals. So that's a charity that you could pick. So that's a way to kind of get us more engaged in active allyship and active participation in our community. So thank you all for attending. I'll open the chat in case there were any questions. Oh, that's so sweet. Panhellenic love right there. Oh, I saw a question. How can I use the barcode? I will make sure that your chapter has access to this link. So just go ahead and ask either your chapter president, your chapter Panhellenic delegate, or your chapter DEI chair. Give me like 15 minutes after this, and then you should have it. And it'll be on the Panhellenic bio as well. So thank you all so much. I hope these are all just like thank yous and all. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Thank you guys. Have a great night.